So I heard a joke the other day about a guy who took his coffee table and made a pallet out of it. I didn't think it was funny. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take these here pallets and try to make a coffee table. So first thing I'm going to do is figure out how to take them apart. Turns out pallets don't like to be taken apart, so I took the Sawzall reciprocating saw. I guess technically it's a jigsaw, just a big one. People call it a reciprocating saw, so that's what I'm going to call it. And I tore the pallets apart. Kinda. Now once I got them cut apart, I guess I got to get all the nails out. You can see how coordinated I am. What's that? If all you got's a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Is that what they say? So that's what I'm doing here, taking care of my problems. Eventually I break down and get on the Amazon.com and order one of them $89 nail remover hydraulic tools, and doesn't improve my dexterity much, but I get the nails out. These are tough little SOB and nails. I think they were invented by the devil. They're rusty and they're twisted. Kind of like me. You know, I'm getting up there in years, so I guess you could say I'm rusty. I've always been a little twisted. But I've never been very coordinated, as you can see here, as I try to manhandle that crowbar. But there's the little devil nails. Twisted, rusty little SOBs. Always the hard way, right? I think I read that on a bumper sticker once. Always the hard way. So that's what I'm going to do here is I got to join these edges and I'm going to do it the hard way. Because I'm cheap. Too cheap to get on the Amazon and order a joiner. I guess I got to prove to myself that I really need one. I've watched 1,000 YouTube videos about how you can get through life without one. All you need is a table saw. Right? So I build this sled. And I guess it works. The idea is you tape down a board and you run it through the table saw and you get a straight edge on it. And then eventually, after doing that 10,000 times, you take all those boards and you run them through the table saw with that straight edge against the fence. Now you got two straight parallel edges. The problem is you only live once, so you don't want to waste all your time at the table saw straightening edges. But it takes me a minute to learn that. I guess as well as not being the most coordinated individual, I'm kind of thick-headed too. And cheap. Not a good combination. Uncoordinated, thick-headed, and cheap. I get so cheap that I try to use each piece of double-sided tape twice, and eventually I find out that that doesn't work. Probably should be wearing a ventilator here so I'm not breathing on all that dust from this old pallet wood with God knows what chemicals soaked into it over the years. What's the worst that could happen? Oh, don't answer that. Oh, look, he can be educated. Not only am I putting the respirator on to help save my lungs, I took that sled and carved a couple of dovetail slots in it and got some of them fancy dovetail clamps. Match Fit, I think, is the company, in case you want some. Matchfit.com. They're probably less than $100 a piece. Anyway, works better than double-sided tape. So if I do 100 of these operations, jointing these edges, I should probably pay for those clamps. Maybe. But hey, I'll have those clamps forever now, right? I can use them for other stuff. Actually, down the road, I buy a track saw and I find I need dovetail clamps. It just happens to be that these are the right size. So it was a good purchase. Now we're going for the stringers, the pallet stringers. We got to get the nails out of them because we don't want to cut the nails on the table saw. It's the only blade I got. I probably should get a new one. It's the one that came with the saw. It's dull and dirty because I'm lazy. Now, we got to cut these to the same length as the other boards, which I don't know what they're called. Whatever they're called, we're going to cut these to the same length. Take full advantage of them. You can look it up on the Google if you want. But we're cutting the stringers down to be the same length as the other boards, making sure there ain't no nails in them. We're going to increase the size of our pile of wood. Pallet wood for the table that we're building. That I'm building. You're watching me build after the fact. There's the pile of wood. It's a good start. Now we gotta straighten the other edge or make it parallel. Make the other edge parallel with the edge that we use the makeshift jointing sled on the table saw. That's the plan. Worked out okay. We got some pretty good joints. No, not those kind of joints. These kind of joints. Moving on. Now we got to go to this thickness planer contraption and get all these boards to be the same thickness, right? Go figure. We're going to make them thickness on the thickness planer. And still I don't have a joiner, otherwise I would have, like a smart woodworker would have first flattened one face on the joiner, then went to the thickness planer. Come to find out that would have maybe made the whole job a lot easier as far as keeping the tabletop as thick as I thought it might end up being. But now I just go run them through the planer without any consideration to how flat they might be. But that's all right. Like I say, in the end, we get her done. And this whole thing was kind of a learning process. Then our wood pile is starting to look okay, I guess. These are about an inch thick at this point, but they're not going to be an inch thick when we're done. Oh well. Moving on. So the idea was to use dowels to align these boards. And It took me a while. I do about half of these with dowels before I finally give up on the idea. And in the end, I buy a biscuit joiner, which worked a lot faster, a lot easier. But the culmination of not having a joiner and not joining one face before I put them through the planer, using dowels with a homemade dowel jig, yada, 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 yada. I get a tabletop that's not very flat. So I learned a lot. That's the point, right? You learn by your mistakes. Well, yep, plenty of learning going on here, let me tell you. Not only that, I'm learning how to make YouTube videos. So somehow I overwrote all the video of the biscuit joining operation and then gluing all the boards up. So you didn't want to see that anyway, did you? Well, you're not gonna, because I lost the video. So moving on. So here we are. We got them all glued up. They're not very flat. They're not uniform thickness like they should be. Like I say, I'm learning a lot on this project. So here I am getting ready to go to the CNC machine. Yeah, I have a CNC machine. So I know, I'm not a woodworker, right? Go ahead. Say it. Put it in the comments. I'll delete them if you want to waste your time. I'm not a woodworker. I have a robot. We're going to use the CNC machine, whether you like it or not, to try to get this flat. So my probably 1-inch tabletop's going to 3/4 to a half, 3/4 if we're lucky. We're going to lose some more material here. So I'm going to shim this baby up, put it on the CNC machine, and let her loose. Get one side flat, and then you know what? We're going to flip it over and get the other side flat. Turns out the table's longer than, or wider, depending on your perspective, than the bed of the CNC machine. So we got to do each side in 2 passes. I don't think I'm going to bore you with watching the CNC go around and around through all that, but that's how we're going to get it flat. And I'll let you in a little secret. It worked. So here's my non-woodworker robot, also known as a CNC machine. You can see my pallet wood tabletop on the working surface, and we're just going to flatten it. Little CNC machine robot's just going to go around and round. I guess a real woodworker would have some kind of manually operated router sled to accomplish the same thing. But my motto's always been work smarter, not harder. So take that, you non-CNC woodworking people. So now, it's pallet wood. So it's got a bunch of holes in it, cracks, knot holes, nail holes, bad joinery from some guy who tried to joint boards on a table saw with a sled rather than forking out the money to buy a joiner. So this is hot glue, black hot glue. We're going to use a little bit of this. Let me tell you, that little piece of steel I'm using there, that flat steel I'm using to cool the glue off and squeeze it down in the cracks and make it flat. You want to put a little mold release on that. That's what that can is up in the top left corner. That's mold release. You got to put that on your steel plate so it doesn't stick. And now we're using CA glue. So don't use the steel plate on the CA glue unless you want to glue a steel plate to the top or bottom of your table. So we put a little CA glue in these cracks, and then we squirt a little activator on them, and boom, like that. It's dry, ready to move on. Here's another reason why I'm either not a woodworker or I'm a bad woodworker. We're going to use epoxy. No, we're not making a river table, but we're going to use epoxy to fill in some of the larger cracks and crevices in the pallet wood, because you know what? Pallet wood's not perfect. That's the whole idea. This isn't supposed to be perfect. It's a beautiful rustic piece of furniture. So that's the concept here. Honestly, it'd be easier to not use pallet wood. And it'd probably even actually be cheaper to not use pallet wood. But we did, or I did. And now for some real fun. Sanding. And even more fun, I mean, we know how much fun sanding is, but sanding epoxy, that's just the epitome of fun, right? So we got a lot of sanding to do because we used a lot of epoxy. Yeah, 40 grit. Take that, epoxy. 40 grit. And takes quite a bit of work. Eventually, I get smart and I switch out that cheap box store sandpaper for some of this expensive 3M Rubicon sandpaper. I think it's 80 grit. That was hard to read, but I think it's 80 grit. And it works so much better. So yeah, 3M Rubicon, well worth it. Buy it. Some tack cloth, clean up, looking good. Moving on. So it turns out this isn't a very safe way to cut these small pieces of red oak. I need these to mount the threaded inserts on the bottom for the legs and for the trim I'm going to add. So it isn't a very safe way to go about doing it. You'll see here in a second just what happens. They could just come flying off the table. So no sense losing an eyeball. I made way more of these than I need. Here's the safer way to go about doing this, I guess. Anyway, I'm okay. All my fingers, toes, and eyeballs are still intact. So I made, like I said, way more of these than I need, but better to have more than you need than not enough. So once again, I overwrote the file video when I burned this oak tree into the tabletop, but trust me, I did it. There it is. Then I covered it with clear epoxy, and now we're sanding that off. It turned out well. So yeah, now I need to make some brackets, a little hardware piece for the bottom of the table. The short ends of the trim have to float in order to allow wood movement in the top as the humidity changes, right? So I hear on the interwebs that the wood's going to expand across the grain. So I have to allow for that. So I'm putting this trim on, and so the trim doesn't explode, I've got to do a little bit of engineering. And yeah, kind of hurts my head to do that, to have to think so hard, but oh well. So I've got the CNC machine up and running here, and we're going to make a little bracket. And these slotted holes will allow, and you'll see when I put it together how it works, but these slotted holes will allow the trim to stay nice and tight against the edge of the table, but yet be able to slide or actually stay put while the tabletop is moving. Probably a better way to say it. So yeah, there's my bracket 1 of 2. So now that that bracket's built, I can go ahead and use the CNC machine to make some corner caps. And the reason I want to do that is because there's going to be a gap on the long edge. Where the long edge piece of trim meets the short side piece of trim, the long side piece of trim meets the short side piece of trim, there's going to be a little gap because we've got to allow for expansion and contraction. So we got, they're not going to fit. They look, I don't like the way they look. So I'm going to cover them up with some cherry end caps. So we've got pallet wood, we've got walnut, and we've got cherry. There's 3 species of wood on this table so far. But I kind of like the contrast, to be honest with you. So here they're coming out of the clamps. Turned out well. Kind of beveled or miter box joints or end joints. I don't know what kind of joints they are, but they're pretty clean looking, I'll tell you that. We're going to sand them on the random orbital sander there, sitting in the vise. Little trick of the trade, I guess. Okay, so now we got to put this walnut trim on. So on these long edges, there's a short piece of walnut that goes right to the bottom of the tabletop. And that's just to give more surface area to the actual piece of trim. The longer piece you see sitting there is the actual trim. I suppose you could call it an apron, but I just call it trim. It's a little different, I guess, than an actual apron on a table. Maybe, like, I don't know. I'm no table expert. But this piece here is just to give me something to glue that longer piece to. Besides just the pallet wood. So we got a little bit of I don't know, baking paper, I guess they call it, underneath there just to keep me from gluing this down to that piece of MDF. And so there we go. That should make sense now why that first piece of walnut went on. So these sides are pretty simple. They're glued solid. They will move with the tabletop. So we'll clamp these up and then we'll let it sit for 12 or 24 hours and then come back and put the end pieces on. The end pieces are a little more complicated. You can kind of see there on both ends, I put some pieces of red oak down. That's where the table legs are going to mount. And I, like an idiot, told you I don't know what I'm doing. I didn't have any relief cuts in those. That should have been 3 pieces of wood, not 1 piece. So I noticed that before I get the table done, and I actually have to cut those with the grain so that, again, to allow the tabletop to move across the grain the way it is there. That table would have just ripped it apart eventually. So right now I'm putting these little, you saw me make the brackets on the CNC machine. I then cut them off on the table saw into these smaller little 2-inch brackets. And now I'm gluing those onto my end pieces. And then we're going to drill some holes in those pieces of oak that are glued down to the bottom of the table. And then we'll put some threaded inserts in there. And that's how we're going to mount these end pieces of trim. They'll be glued to that block in the center. And then those brackets will kind of pull them tight to the edge and then allow for some wood movement. that's the plan anyway. I guess, you know, it's kind of similar to what you do with the breadboard end, I guess, except it's not hidden. And I'm sure I'm not the first guy to think of this. I hope it'll work. Time will tell. I'm not selling this table or giving it away. I'm going to keep it and use it. And so if it explodes with humidity, I'll know. Like I say, this is a learning project. I don't know what the hell I'm doing. I'm just making it up as I go. Here goes the glue. And then we're going to sink those screws, bolts, whatever you want to call them, into the threaded inserts, and we'll go in tight and then back it off a little bit to leave them loose enough to allow the table underneath to slide back and forth in those slotted holes. Okay, it's time to put the finish on. So the finish of choice is Rubio Monocoat. The natural, no tint or color added to it. So, yeah, if you're not familiar with Rubio, if you ever watch Blacktails Studios, it's one of his favorite finishes. Super, super simple. It's a hard wax oil, so it's a wax on, wax off, right, Karate Kids? Yeah, you put it on, like you see here. Let it set up for, I don't know, like an hour. Read the instructions on the can. It's 2 parts. You got to mix it. Yeah, you put it on, and then you let it sit for a while, and you wipe it off, and you're done, and then let it cure for like a week before the next step. Yeah, Rubio Monocoat. So now we have to mount the corner pieces, these pieces of cherry that I made on the CNC machine and glued up, and we're using the CA glue and wood glue, 2-glue method, I'll call it. So the CA glue acts as the clamp and holds the piece in place while the wood glue sets up. So here I set the piece on, and I'm going to mark it so I know where the glue goes, because I don't want glue spilling out onto my finished surface. Because I was going to use hardware, screws and whatnot to mount these, but didn't work out. I decided to glue these on instead. So, yeah. A little dab will do you. Just need a little bit of CA glue around the edges and set them on, push it down. Boom. And then next we're going to put a ceramic hard coat, protective coating finish, I guess. This comes from Blacktails Studios. It's a 2-part procedure. First you put the hard coat, which I'm doing here, and then you let that set for whatever the instructions say to do, and then you put the top coat on, which adds a little extra sheen to your finish, and you're protected from water and stains and whatnot, scratches. Highly recommended. Not cheap. A little bit goes a long ways. And finally, we get to put the legs on. So I ordered some legs from Flowline Designs. I think it's flowlinedesigns.com or something like that. If you Google Flowline legs, I'm sure, table legs, I'm sure you'll find it. So put a little blue tape on that one to keep it from getting scratched with the ratchet. Yeah, gonna sink some of those black screws into the threaded inserts and call it good, really. Nice looking legs. And yeah, I'm not a purist. For you purist woodworkers out there who think you have to make your own legs, well, go for it. I just didn't have time, and I wanted to be done with this. These legs aren't too bad. I think about $100 is what I paid for them, and I think they look pretty good. I'm happy with them. I'm happy with the whole table, honestly. So one last thing I need to do is take some photographs and show you how beautiful it turned out for a piece of pallet wood that was headed for the fire pit.
You know the blues just a funny feeling. People call it a mighty bad disease.